So still some people joining.
Cecile, I can take care of just adding people.
Okay, can you do that? Great.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all very, very much for joining us for the second seminar of the Aesthetics of Noise. I appreciate that this is a time of overabundance of online work and I guess leisure also for some people. And so it's doubly generous of you to take the time and lend us your ear for some noise and noisy thinking. A very productive conversation has come out of our first seminar with Marc Cotin. And I invite you all very warmly to join in once we open the conversation to all the participants. It is my honor and very great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight and my collaborator, Patrick French, whose support is also absolutely crucial to this seminar series, which is a collaboration between the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris and King's College in London. I would also like to introduce Giovanni Menegale, who will be the respondent to Patrick's talk and who will moderate the conversation when we open it up to the virtual floor. Patrick will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and Giovanni will then kickstart the dialogue with him for a few minutes, however long they want to keep it going, before then opening it up to the floor. And I invite you all warmly to join in, and if you will have to introduce yourselves and be part of the conversation. Before saying some more about Patrick and Giovanni, I would also like to thank Marc Cotin, whom some of you know from the last session. I'm immensely grateful to both Patrick and Marc for enabling this collaboration between the Collège and the college, the Collège International de Philosophie and King's College. Also, Daniel Nemenyi and Jonathan Gray have given much of their precious time to help set it up, and I am likewise very grateful to them, as well as naturally the entire team at the Collège International de Philosophie, and in particular, Astrid Sylvain, Jean-Pierre Penas, Véronique Christol, and Delphine Limon, who are the logistical backbone of the Collège. I'd like to thank also Sasha Golob, who has been very generous to associate the Center for Philosophy and Visual Art at King's College to this seminar series. The Collège International de Philosophie is a unique institution and a real lifeboat for philosophical thinking outside of the academic canon. It's a space for complete intellectual self-determination that I think increasingly people crave. The Collège was founded in 1983 by Jacques Derrida, François Châtelet, Jean-Pierre Faye, and Dominique Lecourt, with a mission to allow philosophers to think at the intersections, such as philosophy and art, philosophy and science, or philosophy and law, but not limited to these. It is of a non-governmental origin, it is international in spirit, and it cultivates itself at the margins of established fields of knowledge, paying attention to new research and intersections that are not yet entirely legitimized by academic discourse. Among its former presidents and directeurs de programme are the now towering figures like François Lyotard, Alain Badiou, Catherine Malabou, Bernard Stiegler, Barbara Cassin, Paul Virilio, or Jean-Luc Nancy, and of course, many, many others. If any of you attending tonight feel that your institution would be interested in supporting the Collège, then please get in touch after the seminar. And on this note, let me introduce our speaker this afternoon. Patrick French is professor in the Department of French at King's College. He wrote his PhD on the French literary and theoretical journal Tel Quel in 1993 under the supervision of Professor Annette Lavers at the University College London. As a British Academy postdoc fellow at the University College, he worked on Georges Bataille and 20th century French intellectual history before moving to King's College London in 1999. 4 books have resulted from this work, and they are The Time of Theory, A History of Tel Quel, published in 1996, The Cut, Reading Bataille's Story of the Eye, published in 2000, After Bataille, Sacrifice, Exposure and Community in 2007, and co-edited and translated with Roland François Lac, the Tel Quel Reader in 2003. Patrick's research ranges across French literature, philosophy, and culture of the 20th century, with a particular focus on critical theory, literature, and film. He has written on Maurice Blanchot, Roland Barthes, Jean-Luc Nancy, Gilles Deleuze, and Félix Guattari. More recently, his work is about film philosophy and film theory, and his two most recent books focus on resonances of a cinematographic imaginary in Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu. The book that was published was called Thinking Cinema with Proust, Legenda, in 2018, and Cinema in the Work of Roland Barthes, and the book that came out was Roland Barthes and Film with Bloomsbury in 2019. He's currently developing a funding application for a project on post-war French thought and its relation to fields such as architecture, pedagogy, and psychiatry, called The Social Life of Concepts. A longer-term project is a book on spatial figures in critical theory. So thank you very, very much, Patrick, for joining us tonight. I would also like to introduce Giovanni Menegale, who will be his respondent. Giovanni is a British Academy Research Fellow in the Department of French at King's College. He completed his PhD on Derrida and the phenomenology at the University of Cambridge, and he's currently working on the reception of theories of information and computation in post-war French philosophy, and on a broader monograph on the theme of technology in French phenomenology. So thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you, Patrick and Giovanni, and over to you, Patrick.
Thanks very much, Cecile, and it's great to be here, and thank you to you and to Mark for putting this seminar series together, this great seminar series together, and for inviting me, and thanks to Giovanni as well for being my respondent. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, I hope, about the noise that Bataille makes, in a sense, and how his concept of the Informe relates to concept of information, broadly speaking. And I'll also be talking about Roland Barthes and how he interprets and deploys Bataille's noise. Just before I start, though, I think, having listened to Mark in the last instance of this seminar, and having also read Cecile's book, The Epistemology of Noise, I'm aware that there is a slipperiness to the notion of noise in information theory and more broadly, and its definition poses problems that may not be resolvable. At least I'm not going to, nor am I able to resolve them. So there's a risk then that the notion or concept or idea of noise will come out at the end of this paper the same as it is when it went in. In other words, that there'll be no information here, that it will just be noise in the sense of a kind of background hum, or rather they will bring no noise as information, but just noise as disturbance. So already there, I'm working with two kind of definitions of noise drawn from Shannon's mathematical theory of communication. So desirable noise, if you like, as information and freedom of choice, and undesirable noise as disturbance. And I'm going to punctually refer to these throughout the paper as definition 1, noise information, and definition 2, noise disturbance. So the paper has 4 parts, beginning with this first part, Informe context. So in 1929 to 30, a diverse group of writers, many of them
1929 and 1930, a diverse group of writers.
That shouldn't be happening.
1920.
Oh, okay. I'll try and stop that happening. I obviously recorded something already. So in 1929 to 30, a diverse group of writers, many of them dissidents from the Surrealist movement, ethnographers and art historians, came together in their contribution to the review Document. Under the loose direction of the heretical French philosopher and writer Georges Bataille, and alongside more sober pieces on contemporary art and culture, ethnography and art history, Document included contributions to a regular section of the review titled Dictionnaire critique, or critical dictionary. Okay. Entries in the critical dictionary included such disparate and heterogeneous terms as eye, mouth, architecture, camel, factory chimney, blackbirds, that was on jazz, nightingale, dust, spit, abattoir, Buster Keaton, museum, skyscraper, hygiene, and many others. As this list might suggest, the critical aspect of this dictionary troubles or even suspends the usual function of the dictionary, to give an ordered series of definitions or to define. The document critical dictionary entries serve rather to subvert or displace accepted meanings, to parody the normative function of the dictionary, to produce unexpected associations, to uncover truths hidden under discursive and cultural norms. The critical dictionary has no obvious order, alphabetical or otherwise, and no explanatory apparatus to explain its purpose. Often it features, as it does here, under the overall title or rubric of chronique, suggesting that it is addressing the terms in relation to their deployment or instantiation in the culture of the time. Despite the absence of any systematic approach or overall theory of what the critical dictionary is doing, Bataille's short entry under the title Informe, here, which I'll refrain from translating for now, appears to offer a key to the overall function of the critical dictionary, in proposing that the purpose of a dictionary is not to offer the meanings of words, but their tasks, or besogne. I'll read out these definitions in a second. Not the meanings of words, but their tasks, or besogne, what they do. The purpose of the word informe, Bataille says here, is to déclasser, to declassify or deform, or to bring things down in the world, as Alan Stockel has translated it. Informe thus hints at the overall purpose or counter-purpose of the critical dictionary, to deform definitions. To this extent, the critical dictionary is an anti-dictionary, but one which borrows the form of the dictionary in order to parody it. So it wants to have its cake and eat it, which is always a good thing. So here is the text. Here is the text of Bataille's Informe entry in full. I'm going to read it in French first, and then I'll read the translation into English by Alan Stockel, in which Informe is translated as formless. Informe. Un dictionnaire commencerait à partir du moment où il ne donnerait plus le sens, mais les besognes des mots. Ainsi, informe n'est pas seulement un adjectif ayant tel sens, mais un terme servant à déclasser, exigeant généralement que chaque chose ait sa forme. Ce qu'il désigne n'a ses doigts dans aucun sens et se fait écraser partout comme une araignée ou un ver de terre. Il faudrait en effet, pour que les hommes académiques soient contents, que l'univers prenne forme. La philosophie entière n'a pas d'autre but, il s'agit de donner une redingote à ce qui est une redingote mathématique. Par contre, affirmer que l'univers ne ressemble à rien et n'est qu'informe revient à dire que l'univers est quelque chose comme une araignée ou un crachat. So in English, the dictionary begins when it no longer gives the meaning of words, but their tasks. Thus, formless is not only an adjective having a given meaning, but a term that serves to bring things down in the world, generally requiring that each thing have its form. What it designates has no rights in any sense, and gets itself squashed everywhere, like a spider or an earthworm. In fact, for academic men to be happy, the universe would have to take shape. All of philosophy has no other goal. It is a matter of giving a frock-coat to what is, a mathematical frock-coat. On the other hand, affirming that the universe resembles nothing and is only formless amounts to saying that the universe is something like a spider or spit. So, here Bataille talks about the idea of a dictionary giving the tasks of words rather than their meanings, and ironizes the notion that what academics, whoever they are, want is for things to have form, to have definition. He periodically describes the need for philosophy and science to give things a form or a shape, and to constrain them within a mathematical frock-coat. Counter to this, Bataille proposes that the idea of the informe, or the task, its task, is to declassify, to deform, to flatten or dissipate the shapes and forms of things and concepts. The last sentence is crucial. Bataille's proposition is to imagine that the universe resembles nothing. On this basis, or from this starting point, anything is possible. It is possible to say that the universe is something like a spider or spit. If nothing is possible, anything is possible. There is a dramatic movement from high to low here, and it's significant that Bataille refers to the universe. So he wants to work at a universal level, at the level of the universe, as he'll put it in a later essay called Economy at the Level of the Universe. That is, he's working at the level of totality, origin, and ground, which in his perspective is nothing. So the Informe is an ungrounding idea. It removes stability and certainty from the universe, and paradoxically perhaps draws it down literally to ground level, like a spider or a gob of spittle or an earthworm. What the Informe does then is to introduce contingency and improbability to make forms bleed into one another. By recognizing the demand that each thing have its form, and ironizing the need for science and philosophy for the mathematical frock-coat of defined form, Bataille asks performatively what would transpire if the universe resembled nothing, or if one postulated this, and if the universe was as formless or as a spider or a gob of spittle. His subversive intention is to insert a hypothesis of formal undecidability at an original and universal level, an undecidability between forms. From this starting point of absolute improbability and formlessness, no original matrix or universal order can ground or guarantee the shapes of things or their development, their evolution. Rather, the formlessness that Bataille inserts into thought and aesthetics, like a Trojan horse, operates as a formal principle of undecidability. There's background noise somewhere, but that's okay. So with the Informe then, Bataille is not so much describing the formless as proposing not so much describing the formless as proposing an operation of deformation whereby forms are rendered contingent, undecidable, and interchangeable. So the Informe is an operation rather than a substantive. Rather than the formless, it may be better to refer to it as information or information. So sorry about that pun, that intended pun. So Bataille's Informe, now an acknowledged term in art theory and critical theory, has had a complex history. Neglected for a long time, and especially in the context of the re-engagement with Bataille's thought by French post-structuralist writers such as Foucault, Derrida, and Kristeva, among others, the Informe and Bataille's pre-war writing in general were brought more into relief in the 1980s in a series of translations and critical essays in the US art theory journal October, particularly by Rosalind Krauss, and in part under the impetus of extensive work by Bataille on Denis Ollier, whose book Against Architecture was first published in French in 1974, and it was the first full-length monograph devoted to Bataille. And incidentally, Ollier's book took as one of its starting points the entry Architecture in the Critical Dictionary of Documents. The first translations in English of the Critical Dictionary entries were published in October, and a number of critical debates have ensued, particularly around the notion of the relation between the Informe and Julia Kristeva's notion of the abject, and between Krauss and French art theorist Georges Didier Huberman on the question of whether the work of the Informe was or is dialectical or not. What is at stake here, what might be at stake here as I see it, is the question of whether it is the noise of the body which is disrupted in itself, or the question of whether this noise, this disturbance, definition 2, is susceptible of being resolved or integrated back into the system as information. These debates have tended to deploy the notion of the Informe in the context of the visual arts. I want, in this paper, to return to an earlier and less prominent moment of the theorization of Bataille's Informe, and to think it in the context of the dictionary of which it's a part. That is, I want to consider what it is that the Informe does to meaning, and by extension, to information, although I acknowledge that these two things are not at all equivalent. So the question might be, is the formless the informe noise as disturbance, definition 2, or noise as information, definition 1, or both, or neither? So the earlier and less prominent moment of the theorization of the informe I want to consider starts with a contribution by French theorist Roland Barthes to a dual conference on Antoine Artaud and Georges Bataille, organized by the review Tel Quel in 1972. Tel Quel, a key journal of the theoretical ferment of the 1960s and 1970s in France, was a key player in the critical re-evaluation of Bataille's work. Barthes was a fellow traveller of the review without being a full member of the group. So I don't know why that keeps happening, but I'll try and control my keyboard. Barthes' contribution to the conference, to this Artaud Bataille conference, here he is in 1972 alongside Philippe Solers. Barthes' contribution was distinct from the predominant focus of the conference on Bataille's post-war work, in that Barthes' focus is the essay The Big Toe, or Le Gros Orteil in French, from Document, and Barthes' contribution is an essay called Les Sorties du Texte, translated as The Outcomes of the Text. The slide shows Bataille's essay in Document alongside photographs of big toes by Jacques-André Boiffard, and I'll explain later a bit what the big toe is doing here. Also of relevance, but I'm not going to have a lot of time to go into it in detail, is an engagement with this material on the part of French psychoanalyst Pierre Fédidas, who devoted a number of essays to the Informe in the 1990s, collected in the volume Par où commence le corps humain. This title, literally translated, Where Does the Human Body Start?, is a reference to Bataille's entry mouth in the critical dictionary, which I'll come to later. But it already suggests something of Fédidas' concerns with the psychoanalytic register of regression, movement back to a supposedly earlier phase or stage in infant development. The crucial point for me is that Fédidas considers the Informe and Barthes' comments on the big toe as part of an operation of what he calls écrasement, literally crushing, in which the meaning, or if you like, the information of words is obliterated or crushed under the effect of the performative and bodily enjoyment, or jouissance, of words, as if mouthing the words, the enjoyment of words in the mouth, were to crush or deform their meaning. As if the information, definition 1, were to be rendered inaudible by the sheer vocality or noise, definition 2, of its articulation, a noise that drowns out information in its vocalization. So to briefly rehearse the context thus far here, Bataille proposes a definition of the operation of the Informe, or what it does, in the Critical Dictionary of Document in 1929. This idea is taken up in the theorization of visual forms, and the Informe is now part of the contemporary vocabulary of critical terms. Barthes' essay, Les Sorties du Texte, focuses rather than on visual forms on meaning. Discussion of Barthes' text will then help to bring out some of the issues that link the operation of the Informe to information theory later on, and to the concept, notion, or idea of noise, which is the focus of this seminar series. So, second part is going to focus on Barthes' essay, Les Sorties du Texte, or the outcomes of the text. It's translated by Richard Howard as the outcomes of the text, as I've said, and this concerns a short essay by Bataille called The Big Toe, published in Document in 1929. In this essay, Barthes considers some of the methodological implications of Bataille's approach to meaning in this early work, and offers a way of understanding the operation of the critical dictionary and the task that the Informe performs. Already, perhaps, we can see that semantic meaning is being undercut by similarity at the phonemic level between orteil and sortie. So les sorties du texte and le gros orteil, you can see, I hope, the similarity there, as if Barthes' argument were being driven by poetic and material associations at the level of the letter. Barthes structures his essay according to a methodology which at the same time mimics the format of the dictionary again and takes it aslant. He says he'll not seek to explain the big toe, but rather to articulate or énoncer its sortie, the elements that come out of it, its outcrops or outcomes, as it's been translated. These outcomes, he says, will be given names and arranged alphabetically so as to subvert or déjouer, in his words, any synthesizing and developmental order. Here, a pseudonumerical ordination displaces the symbolic orientation of themes. Despite this tendency to enumerative listing, already Barthes hints at what is at stake in the critical dictionary and in Bataille's semiotic ethos. He underlines the evaluative process at work in the selection of what comes out of the text. What he appears to mean by this is that the elements Barthes selects and uses as subtitles are those aspects which stand out for him, which he values subjectively. What is named in the dictionary, the terms it includes, arises not out of an intention to define, but to isolate and bring out what is valued. And this notion of value derives from the philosophy of Nietzsche, and it's among the first instances of a Nietzschean inflection in Barthes' work. For Nietzsche, value or evaluation precedes and predetermines meaning and fact. Barthes writes that in Bataille's The Big Toe essay, knowledge is fractured, pluralized, as if the one of knowledge were constantly pushed to divide into two. Synthesis is tricked, subverted, knowledge is there, not destroyed, but displaced. Its new place is, according to a term in Nietzsche, that of a fiction. Meaning precedes and predetermines the fact, value precedes and predetermines knowledge. Bataille cites Nietzsche further on in the text from The Will to Power. No fact exists in itself. What occurs is a set of phenomena selected and grouped by a being who interprets them. There is no such thing as a state of fact. On the contrary, a meaning must be introduced before there can be a fact. Barthes draws from Nietzsche this emphasis on the value of words over and above their meaning, their sense, and this approach has been referred to by Shane Weller as an active philology. For Bataille and for Barthes, I would propose Nietzsche's transvaluation of all values takes the form of an eroticization of meaning. What signifies is what instigates desire, or its opposite, disgust, the effective dynamics of attraction and repulsion, which we'll come to later. It's in the final fragment of the essay, however, that Barthes, I've got to be careful to not to mix up Barthes and Bataille. It's the final fragment of the essay that Barthes comes closest to a theory of the linguistics of evaluation and to Bataille's notion of the Informe. The final fragment is titled Vocable in French, which I imagine is pronounced vocable in English, although I'm not absolutely sure. And this immediately poses problems of translation. As Barthes points out, vocable is an apt term to designate the eruption of value which takes place within certain words, Since in French, vocable means both a naming and une appellation, thus a voicing, a noise or a noising, and the patronage of a saint. Vocable thus suggests the evaluation implicit in naming and a divine power or spirit, as indicated by another term Barthes deploys to designate these value words, Newman words. Newman deriving from the Latin notare, to nod, suggesting a divine power invested in inanimate objects through the ordaining gestures of the gods. In English, vocable is used in linguistics to designate words used without reference to their meaning. Filler words such as and would be vocables from this point of view. And in another sense, vocable indicates something like the words of an idiom, a private language shared between a couple or a group. To think then of the entries in Bataille's critical dictionary, as Barthes wants to suggest, as vocables, is to think of them as part of an idiom which displaces orthodox meaning, outside the dictionary definition, and as also carrying and operating an evaluation. The vocables, Barthes pursues, erupt in the discourse of knowledge. They are the mark of the writerly, écriture, what Barthes calls écriture, rather than of what can be written, or écrivance. They are sensory and amorous words which designate seductions or repulsions. And it's evident that this theory of value words, Newman words or vocables, moves in a quite different direction from the semiology which Barthes had done so much to establish in the early 1960s. To conceive of words as embodying a value of seduction or abjection goes further too than the stress on connotation through which Barthes attempted to escape from the strictures of semiology. Bataille thus serves Barthes as a platform of a sort for the elaboration of a theory of value, an active philology, as Shane Weller has called it, which he developed further in his work of the 1970s. To return to Bataille, however, Barthes suggests that the latter, who, as we know, had an acute and intimate knowledge of Nietzsche and was profoundly influenced by him, had already begun to theorize the opposition between knowledge words and value words, or names and vocables, pointing implicitly to Bataille's third essay in Document, The Language of Flowers. Barthes tells us, however, that Barthes shifted the terms around somewhat. Sorry, lost them. Yeah, that's right. Shifted the terms around somewhat. The ontological or philosophical element is the word, while the vector of evaluation, seduction and repulsion, is called the aspect of things, which Barthes equates to his own vocable. This introduces the decisive values of things, this is a quote from Bataille, and derives from what Bataille calls the decisive movements of nature. It is clear that what Bataille intended was a subversion or a displacement of the discourse of knowledge or of epistemological assurance through a performative re-evaluation of words which draw on their aspects, which he considered to be rooted in nature, that is, in a base materiality. The terms seduction and repulsion should moreover be considered in their cosmic dimension, akin to the rotated rhythms of the universe, as described by Bataille in an early and programmatic text, the solar anus, which I'll come to in the next section. Developing the methodological implications of vocables and Bataille's aspect, Barthes refers to Bataille's proposition in the Informe entry that a dictionary should give not the meaning but the tasks or besogne of words. And adds that this is a very linguistic idea, naming Wittgenstein and Bloomfield in parenthesis. Yeah, so we might refer to the later Wittgenstein's emphasis on what words do rather than on their meaning or reference. So he says the meaning of a word is its use in philosophical investigations, and Bloomfield's behavioristic critique of linguistic meaning. But I don't know if these, I don't think from Barthes' point of view, these go as far as Bataille. And this is hinged around the word besogne, which is another value word, according to Barthes, which is again quite difficult to translate. Task contains but does not fully realize the sense of an everyday concern or burden of work. Besogne goes further than the functional terms of use or usage and connotes labor and jouissance, indicating an affective and erotic dimension. In summary, we could say that what Bataille proposes as the operation of the Informe, and by extension of the critical dictionary as a whole, is an anti-dictionary which displaces and subverts the normative meanings of words by a performative rewriting of their affective and erotic values, a factor which, following Nietzsche, precedes and predetermines their semantic definition. The point is to say that definition is subsequent to and determined by the jouissance of the word, where the word functions, Barthes says, something like a fetish. So the critical dictionary of Document then is an apparatus that introduces a principle of undecidability, destabilises accepted values, meanings and definitions, and introduces a radical contingency whereby any one thing can be proposed as equivalent to any other thing, and is driven by an evaluation which, while contingent and arbitrary, is nevertheless claimed to derive from a natural or material basis in an economy of attraction and repulsion. And in the next part of the talk, I'll show how this strategy is also at work in other texts by Bataille from the late 1920s and early 1930s. So this is called Solar Anus, Mouth and Pineal Eye. So in this part, I'll widen my consideration of Bataille's early work to other published and unpublished texts written in the same period in order to support an understanding of Bataille's overall strategy of displacement with regard to orthodoxy. In a text which defies generic nomination, written around 1928, called the Solar Anus or l'Anus solaire, Bataille proposes something like a blueprint for the vision that programs his writing of the period. There, Bataille names the driving logic of his text parody and writes that it is clear that the world is purely periodic. In other words, that each thing seen is the parody of another, or is the same thing in a deceptive form. Therefore, he continues, a dog devouring the stomach of a goose, a drunken vomiting woman, a sobbing accountant, a jar of mustard represent the confusion that serves as the vehicle of love. Crazy. What determines these associations is neither narrative nor logical order, nor is it the juxtaposition of normally separate semantic entities oriented towards the evocation of a surreality or a transcendent and aestheticized reality. Associations such as the universe is a spider or spit, or love is a jar of mustard, or love is a jar of mustard, operate through a copula. In other words, the is, or the plus in, or the equal sign in x equals y, which proposes an equivalence between two things of a different order, thus installing a corrosive difference. Bataille thus proposes a tendency towards what he calls total identification, in which everything would become everything else, a state of formless non-differentiation. He writes, ever since sentences started to circulate in brains devoted to reflection, an effort at total identification has been made, because with the aid of a copula, each sentence ties one thing to another. What Bataille calls total identification is equivalent to what he will later theorize. Well, I say theorize, but I think that there's quite a lot of, I don't want to suggest that Bataille is a wholly systematic thinker and that he has a theory as such, but what he calls total identification here is equivalent to what he will later theorize under the name economy at the level of the universe, as I noted earlier. As an alternative articulation of the Informe, it insinuates that since the universe is formless and that each thing is the parody or deceptive form of another, everything is potentially every other thing. The absence of grounded rational form, which this vision proposes, leaves the space open for the free play of attraction and repulsion. In other words, for the work of the phantasm. And one can see this at work in the supposedly obscene narrative text, The Story of the Eye, Histoire de l'œil, written around this time. Their round or ovoid forms, eyes, eggs, the sun, testicles, and so on, bleed into one another purely because they are round, and the permutation of these forms, together with the arbitrary instances of the letters of their words, soleil, œil, earth, are visited upon the protagonists of the narrative with murderous and obscene consequences. This perverse or phantasmatic vision also generates the deformative readings of human and other forms practiced in other entries in the critical dictionary and in a series of other early texts by Bataille. So in mouth, for example, the dictionary definition, the critical dictionary entry under mouth, again accompanied by photographs by Jacques-André Boiffard, Bataille demonstrates the formal undecidability of human corporeal form, and he writes, the mouth is the beginning, or if one prefers, the prow of animals. In the most characteristic cases, it is the most living part, in other words, the most terrifying for neighbouring animals. But man does not have a simple architecture like beasts, and it is not even possible to say where he begins. He possibly starts at the top of the skull, but the top of the skull is an insignificant part, incapable of catching one's attention. It is the eyes or the forehead that play the meaningful role of an animal's jaws. Animal form is construed as architecturally straightforward, the mouth by Bataille. The mouth is the organ of veracity, but human form, altered by upright posture and by the evolutionary withdrawal of the prominence of the mouth, begins improbably and insignificantly. There is a disjunction, in other words, between the insignificant top of the skull, which in other texts Bataille will seek to challenge through the phantasm of the pineal eye, and the meaningful sight of the eyes. The violence of the mouth will nevertheless reassert itself, Bataille argues in the rest of this short piece, when it comes to explosive impulses expressed in screams or in the throwing back of the head, such that it reverts to its place as an extension of the spinal column, just as it is in the constitution of animals. Fair enough, but this perverse and scientifically unlikely hypothesis is introduced by a question: where does the human body begin? Which is patently absurd despite its benign appearance. The whole structure through which corporeal form is radically altered in instances of explosive impulses arises from a crossing and mixing of registers between beginning and meaning. Animals begin at the prow of the mouth, that is at the part that is most thrust forward, which is most prominent, and this prominence is made equivalent to significance, to meaningfulness. If the most prominent part of human architecture is the top of the skull, you could ask why not the nose or some other part. It is not significant, not the site of meaning, which is in the eyes or in the mouth as the organ of language. Form, we might infer from this reading of Bataille's work, is scrambled by a performatively subversive question. Slightly later in the 1930s, but still within the orbit of the Informe, as defined by Bataille in 1929, in the unpublished text collected under the title Dossier of the Pineal Eye, Bataille arranges an abrasive revision of human corporeality around the philosophical aberration of the mythical organ that joins body and soul, the pineal eye. In the first text of this series, called the Decisive, Bataille writes, "I adapted myself in a fairly disordered way so that the most improbable thing in the world, the most overwhelming as well, something like foam on the lips, would at the same time appear to me to be necessary. Improbability, which I'm here joining to formlessness as a mode of radical undecidability, is deliberately, one could say strategically, posed as necessary, as a decision to ruin decisions. The apparently anthropological accountings that recur throughout Bataille's writing are, from this perspective, nothing but, or merely, consequences of this initial strategic decision, which I have called performative, to indicate how it stems from a provocation, from play, rather than from historical or anthropological veracity or referential accuracy. Still, the deliberate decision to adapt oneself to the most insignificant or improbable thing is experienced, Bataille says, as necessary, and as driven by an experience of overwhelming force. The improbable or formless is not insignificant in the sense of lacking impact, although it may be non-significant in the sense of lacking in meaning. Bataille overturns hierarchies of valuation, as Barthes will point out in his essay on the big toe. The category of the low, which captures both spatial position and moral value, is strategically, and I would add performatively, valued so as to upset the usual correspondences between the high, the beautiful, and the good, and the bad, the ugly, and the low. In a further draft of the Pineal Eye essay, Bataille attempts an ostensibly more systematic delineation of the formlessness he will define in Document and its implications. He writes, "To the extent that a description of human life that goes back to the origins tries to represent what the formless universe has accomplished in producing man rather than something else, how it has been led to this useless production and by what means it made this creature something different from all the rest. To this extent, it is necessary to abandon scientific anthropology, which is reduced to a babbling even more senile than puerile, reduced to giving answers that tend to make the questions put to it seem ludicrous, whereas these answers alone are miserably so when confronted with the inevitable and demanding brutality of an interrogation taking upon itself the very meaning of life that this anthropology supposedly aims to describe. The demanding brutality which the subject experiences is such that scientific anthropology must be abandoned, Bataille proposes, cannot answer the question, lived and experienced at the level of the body, of why this form, a form Bataille calls useless in a forewarning of his later economic theories, of why this form is as it is rather than otherwise, more drastically why man has been produced rather than something else. This is a counter-anthropology, and in the absence of anthropological or philosophical systems which can give satisfactory answers to the fundamental question why this form rather than that, man, or l'homme in Bataille's words, is obliged to listen to his own phantasms. Rodolphe Gachet, in a work originally published in German in 1978 on Bataille, has described this as a phantasmatic mythology, which I think is a really good description. It's clear then, I hope, that Bataille's work on this period is an abrasive attack on the classical accounts of human form, and similarly abrasive in relation to orthodox philosophical concepts, the mathematical frock-coat he refers to in the Informe entry. In the next and concluding part of the paper, I will try to discuss how this strategy relates to the concept of noise as defined in information theory. I originally intended to consider the relation of Bataille's notion of expenditure and the Informe to the concept of entropy, which is obviously relevant, but ran into difficulties of length, complexity, and understanding. So that will have to be for another day. So, final part, nature takes payment. Admittedly, it's quite a jump from Bataille's early writings to the information theory which emerged post-World War II in the US. These are entirely different contexts. Bataille and Document intervene in the late 1920s and early 1930s in a context determined by the intersection of a subversive aesthetics running counter to the contemporary doctrine of the surrealist movement around André Breton. Also in the context of ethnography, particularly that emerging at this time around Marcel Gréaule and Michel Leiris at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. Information theory emerges in the US after World War II. This is very broad and crude, in part through work at the Bell Labs. Among its foundational texts is Claude Shannon's essay, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, in the Bell Systems Technical Journal, later published as a book with an appended essay by Warren Weaver in 1949, with the more ambitious title, The Mathematical Theory of Communication. Other work would ensue. It's important to mention, obviously, work by Norbert Wiener, more associated with the related but distinct field of cybernetics. I'm not going to rehearse here the relatively involved narrative of the development of information theory and its influence in France, because I can't, and because this has been done elsewhere. Bernard Gagan, among others, has charted the ways in which figures such as Roman Jakobson and Claude Lévi-Strauss, who incidentally, Lévi-Strauss was among the pseudonymous contributors to Document in the late 1920s, how they adopted models and schemas from information theory and cybernetics in their thinking about linguistic models that would form the basis for structuralism and semiotics as they developed in France after World War II. I'll also note that Barthes adopted some of the definitions and orientation of information theory in his work on semiotics and narrative theory in the early to mid-1960s, particularly in his work for the journal Communication, on the photographic message, and his work for the filmology movement on the traumatic unit, that is, the information, according to Shannon and Weaver's definition, conveyed in experimental film tests. By the early 1970s, as we have seen, Barthes is moving away from this semiotic model, exploring the elaboration of an evaluative semiotics, in which information, in this sense, is merged with eroticization, with what my body values. Perhaps one might argue much post-structuralist theory and aesthetic theory influenced by it is operating in the blurred zone between definition 1 and definition 2 of noise, informational uncertainty or noise, and disruptive noise, noise which may be evaluated as disruption, thus recuperated as a kind of information. For example, in an essay on film stills from Eisenstein in 1970, Barthes distinguishes between 3 levels of meaning, broadly conceived: the level of information, that's the first level; second level, the obvious level of signification; and third level, the third meaning, which gives the essay its title. And this third level of meaning he calls obtuse. So information, obvious, and obtuse. The obtuse meaning is less identifiable, potentially unintended, and pertains to affect and to the body. Barthes says it's the kind of affect that it provokes is connected for him to a derisory region of things, such as exemplified with Bataille's big toe. So the obtuse, which would later in Barthes' work turn into the punctum of the photograph, is a form of disturbance or perturbation which is evaluated effectively, or in Barthes' terms, which are arguably also those of Bataille, erotically. And it's perhaps around this issue, on this terrain between information and erotic evaluation, that we might most fruitfully explore the dialogue, or perhaps lack of it, between Bataille's Informe and information theory. Some glimpses of Shannon and Weaver's The Mathematical Theory of Communication can be brought into relief to act as hooks for Bataille. Noise, Shannon says, is what perturbs a signal. It is a chance variable. And in a superbly enigmatic aside, which resonates with Bataille's concerns, I think, Shannon writes that in a given encoded system, where the chance for error or equivocation is limited by a restricted number of choices, extending the latitude for choice will result in, quote, nature taking payment through greater levels of uncertainty. Bataille might perhaps concur with the notion that nature demands the entropic dissolution of forms, although in a broader sense, Bataille's notion of the infinite capacity for expenditure of the universe, the idea that the sun gives its energy without reserve, move in the opposite direction to the second law of thermodynamics. The directions of travel of information theory, as conceived by Shannon and Weaver, on the one hand, and Bataille's Informe, on the other, might also be seen to be diametrically opposed. While as I proposed above, Bataille seeks to introduce a principle of undecidability into the mathematical, what he calls the mathematical world of forms, demanded by what he calls academics, information theory demands decidability. Just so much uncertainty as to guarantee a quotient of information above redundancy, but no more. Otherwise, the signal risks being crushed, écrasé, or rendered inaudible under the formless din of noise. In this light, we might suggest that from Shannon's point of view, noise is information with qualified levels of uncertainty and undecidability, while for Bataille no such qualification is justified, though I'm not at all sure about that point. Another telling point comes, as we know, in Weaver's appended essay in the Mathematical Theory of Communication, where he makes what he presents as a surprising point that noise being equivalent to an increased uncertainty, and information a measure of one's freedom in selecting a message. Quote, if the uncertainty is increased, the information is increased. And this sounds as if noise were beneficial, exclamation mark. So noise and information start to look like the same thing, since both arise from increased uncertainty. How then can we tell the two apart? Weaver comments in a statement that resonates with Barthes, that uncertainty can have good and bad, Weaver comments in a statement that resonates with Barthes that uncertainty can have, quote, good and bad connotations. There is the uncertainty that arises, quote, by virtue of freedom of choice on the part of the sender, and that is desirable uncertainty. And there is the uncertainty that arises because of errors or because of the influence of noise, which is undesirable uncertainty. Noise then splits into two here, noise as undecidable information and noise as undesirable error. The hinge point for me seems to be around the issue of desirability. For Weaver, what is desirable is what is intended, what arises out of the freedom of choice of the agent, in other words, the subject. Weaver's next expression is also significant. Quote, it is thus clear where the joker is in saying that the received signal has more information. What he means is some of the information is spurious and introduced via noise, and this must be subtracted in order to get the useful information, he says. Useful is a trigger, of course, from a Battaillean perspective, but Weaver having introduced this notion of the joker, we may wonder about a scenario in which the intention of the agent is not one of goodwill, but one calculated to dissipate form performatively, to inculcate undecidability, to make or to perform noise, like Maxwell's demon. This idea can be countered, however. Whatever Bataille, or might be countered, whatever Bataille intends by stating that the universe resembles spit, he nevertheless communicates. And this idea, however subversive or uncertain, is information. The subversive intent is desirable information still. Bataille means what he says, and he says it, and this would seem a particularly pertinent objection given that Informe is an entry in the critical dictionary. However, if one attends to Bataille's proposition that the Informe is a term serving to declassify, thus to drive a wedge between the intentions of the speaker, ostensibly to give form to what he says and means, and the supposedly natural attractions and repulsions of things and words, then the picture might not be so clear. Bataille's Informe entry then looks like a joker or a demon of performative uncertainty, a willed sacrifice of agency in language. The discussion between desired uncertainty and non-desired uncertainty is blurred if what is desired, perhaps it's blurred, if what is desired is the abdication of the will and the dissipation of secure forms, including that of the agent, him or herself. In a similar vein, Barthes's proposition of the word valued for its effective charge rather than its meaning might scramble, or in Fedida's terms, crush the principle of the goodwill of the interlocutor and the desired decidability on which information theory depends. Bataille's Informe then might be identified as a species of undecidability, but of what kind? It is not a question of ambivalence, of a threshold or twilight zone between decidable entities such as day, night, black, white, yes and no. Formlessness seems to ruin the decision between forms and rather poses an impossibility of discerning forms as such, since in the blur of formlessness, all forms are equivalent to all others. If the information theory concept of noise identifies the inevitable resistance of the channel, or a relatively controllable field of indeterminacy, one that the system can cope with, the Informe, on the other hand, might be construed as primary noise, subversively and performatively reinserted back into the system to scramble its decisions. As a conclusion that's not a conclusion, I'll offer the following points, or objection really, or point to a problem I've not really addressed, which might also link back to Mark's paper last week, which is the radical disjunction between what we might call the symbolic and semantic level on which Bataille is operating, apparently, that of forms and words and ideas, and the statistical level, which is the concern of information theory and of data. Perhaps the idea of noise as disturbance, so that's definition 2, is on one side, which is the symbolic side, and information noise, definition 1, is on the statistical side. So I'll end with a question: is undesirable noise, or Bataille's Informe, only that information which as subjects we evaluate subjectively as spurious? In the headless regime of data, perhaps all noise is information. Thank you. I'm going to unshare my screen now if I can.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for this. I think it's echo now. Everybody else can hear it too. So I'm going to eclipse myself straight away to say thank you so much. So many stimulating thoughts. I took notes madly, and I'm very glad we recorded it so I can listen to it again, and so much to think. So Giovanni, over to you.
Thanks, Cecile. Thank you, Patrick, for a daunting and intriguing paper in equal measure. I'll try and keep my comments brief. And
I haven't shared my screen.
Yes, you have.
Oh, great. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah.
Don't unshare yourself, though. Yeah. I think what I found really interesting about the juxtaposition of Bataille with Barthes is the way in which thinking about the Informe and information theory together through what could be called a kind of later stage in the development of post-war French thought or post-structuralism, whatever one wants to call it, through these figures like Barthes, Kristeva, and others. What's interesting about that is that it slightly displaces, maybe it displaces the question of semantic meaning, perhaps even more than you suggested. I'm not quite sure what you thought about that, because if one reads the mathematical theory of communication, you have this bracketing of semantic meaning. It's very explicit, and then if you approach a text like that as someone who comes from, I don't know, literary theory or philosophy, the question you want to ask yourself is, okay, well, we emit this signal, it goes from A to B, and then how do we put the meaning back in at the end? Whereas what's interesting about these perspectives that sort of foreground ideas of function and relation, force and desire, maybe through the discourse of psychoanalysis and drawing on Nietzsche, is that they relativize this question of semantic meaning in a way that I think is new in how we consider, for example, the broader reception of these ideas for post-structuralism and contemporary thought more generally. So those are very loose kind of ideas, but that's just to say that I think what interested me and compelled me about your paper was the way in which this term informe, even beyond Bataille, it's unstable because it retains a kind of notion of form that I'm wondering whether the statistical theory of communication can really account for. So even if Bataille's intention here is in a way to deconstruct the idea of an organized universe, in some sense, he still wants to think about relation and structure. And so I wonder what you drew from the Shannon-Weaver theory, I mean, insofar as one can, in terms of these ideas of relation and structure, because I think there's something about the way in which the statistical measure sort of defines information, that something about this idea of structure gets perhaps lost. So here I have, I had just two reflections on this from what I understood of the actual mathematical theory. And they're based on two ways of measuring information. They're not two different measures of information, but they're two different ways in which information can be measured. And one is measuring an entire message as a whole. And what's interesting about that is what that seems to do is you measure a degree of variation or diversity of elements, but it's as if you took a kind of string of symbols in the message and you just threw them all into a bag and they lose their sequence, and all you measure is the overall diversity of elements. And so I wonder how that connects with Bataille. I mean, I thought of Leibniz again. We talked about Leibniz in the last paper, because for him, God's principle in creating the universe, the best of both possible worlds, is to maximize diversity while also minimizing, if you like, the rules that are required to keep everything together. So maximum diversity, as much information as possible, if you like, but but with a minimum amount of rules or rules of composition to keep all this stuff together in a way that is relatively well ordered. So I wondered, how does this compare to a Battalian cosmos, and does it at all, how does it work maybe with this statistical measure of information? The second point about this measure is that another way of measuring it is as the string of elements it is kind of heard or transmitted or communicated. So it's a more dynamic measure, and in that sense, you're measuring variation. You're measuring what has already been received, and the measure, if you like, is it is almost like a measure of what you might expect to come next. So on the basis of what you've heard, on the basis of the quantity of information that's come, what would you expect to come next? And that made me think about these themes of desire, and even these ideas of body parts that are more prominent or significant, and this idea of valuation, and how can these notions of information and noise relate to the idea of how something is regarded as prominent or exceptional. So I know this is very abstract, but it made me, I was trying to kind of tie some of these theories back onto what you were saying about Bataille. If I have time just to say something about the mouth.
Yeah.
Cécile, is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. But if you could do me the favor, if you want Patrick to respond, if you could at the end kind of make 3 pithy points that kind of.
Right. Yeah, I'll just okay. I'll just go through these other points. One is going back to Bataille's point on the mouth, the text on the mouth. I wonder if you could say something more about that, because there's the theme of the screen, which obviously relates to noise. So And I wonder if you could say something more about that. There's in that text, Bataille talks about someone being overwhelmed by fury and terror and suffering. So there's a kind of excessive information there, which then leads to a kind of another kind of noise, which is the scream. So I wondered what you thought about that, and to what extent these ideas about limit experience can be linked back to what you were saying about these two different definitions of noise and information, and whether for Bataille a limit experience is a kind of threshold between these two ideas of information that you were talking about. So I think I don't know how to summarize all these points, Cécile, but maybe I should just stop and see what Patrick makes of them, and maybe we can come back to them.
Or perhaps if you could give a few keywords, just a few for Patrick to kind of latch on to respond, because it's always hard to summarize for someone else when it's so dense and rich.
So okay, I can have a go at answering not everything that Giovanni has very eloquently described. So yes, some of it is yeah, very, I couldn't put it better myself, but I suppose I could say three things, I think. One is about in relation to what you said at the beginning about the relation between Barthes and Bataille and Shannon and Weaver, which is quite a challenge. But I suppose this might kind of relate to the very broadly to the shape of post-war French thought, so not specifically to information theory. But I think information theory is very useful for Barthes and for others of his generation, specifically in bracketing semantic meaning, or in looking like it's bracketing semantic meaning, because then they can then approach meaning from a structural point of view, and they can approach it from a kind of unitary point of view in which they're pointing to the minimal unit of signification, the sign or the signifier, etc. So they can bracket, or they can get away from a whole approach to literature and culture, which thinks of it in terms of its content, if you like, its semantic meaning. So it acts as a kind of hinge to bracket semantic meaning, but not completely, because they're still dealing with semantics. In the journal Communication, for example, they're dealing with cultural meaning, but they're looking at it through the lens of this kind of, I wouldn't go so far as to say statistical perspective, but let's just call it that for the moment. But then the later development of French thought is precisely towards this more dynamic, or what you called, I think, what you put in terms of relations of force, force and affect or intensity. And that's a kind of nod to, I suppose, to Deleuze, who I didn't mention at all, but is, I think, there, in which then harks back to someone like Bataille, whose very, I think, quite confused conceptions around the Informe are used by Bataille to reintroduce this evaluation and this dynamics and this kind of Nietzschean sense that not only are we not interested in the semantic aspect of meaning, but looking at it from a structural point of view, but we're now interested in its intensities and its dynamism and its force. So in that context, I suppose what my paper was trying to do is use information theory as a kind of hinge as well to illustrate things about post-war French thought. So perhaps that's not exactly about the aesthetics of noise, but using noise as a concept to do something else. I think I'll try and answer that. I know there are lots of really interesting things in what you said, but I'll try and respond to the other aspects, which seem to me to revolve around this issue of, which I might answer by talking about the evolution of Bataille's thought. So at this moment, in the late 20s, I think he's kind of coincident with surrealism. He has this, what I described as a quite performative and subversive intent premised on this vision, this very strange idea that that of the copula making a distinction between any one thing and any other thing, and pointing towards what he calls a total identification, which I suppose starts to look a bit like the Leibnizian bag that you referred to, with everything kind of jumbled around in it and this kind of total diversity. But I think as his work continues, he starts to become more structural, if you like. So when he introduces this distinction between, for example, general economy and restricted economy in his post-war work, then he's moving, well, I suppose in some ways the general economy, it also looks like this total diversity, which you talked about. But I think he's also introducing this idea of a threshold between restricted economy and general economy, or a threshold of the subject, a point at which the scream emerges, if you like, out of an excess of affect or fear or intensity. So I think there is a kind of shift in Bataille's work towards, let's say, a more structured world, in which there's one domain in which information is feasible and readable and understandable, and then this kind of wider or other general economy or general sphere, which is in which everything just merges into a seamless din, I guess, and that might be more pertinent to the aesthetics of noise.
And can I ask you something about that you touched on the theme of sexuality, because it seems like you were hinting, I don't know if this is in the Pierre Fédida book, but you were hinting at something to do with the drives, and there are these sorts of evolutionary or developmental traces that manifest themselves as impulses or a kind of noise or disturbance. And is that something that one would, in Bataille, would oppose to desire as something that is more of a instrumental kind of project, or could one sort of rethink of desire in terms of the drives?
That's very interesting, and I don't know if I'll be able to answer it in a satisfactory way, but I'm not sure that desire, the term or the concept of desire, I could be wrong, others may disagree, have much of a place in Bataille's work. So in that light, I think it is, although he doesn't use excessively, he doesn't use a psychoanalytic vocabulary really, or doesn't use a vocabulary of the drives, but it is more akin to kind of what one might call a more, well, in very crude sense, more primal affective, or what I called in one of my books, affectivity without a subject. That's in After Bataille, Sacrifice, Exposure, Community, just if you want to know.
I think maybe on that note I should open it up to the floor. Would anyone like to come forward with a question?
I would suggest that people either just speak if nobody else is speaking, or use the raise your hand function. If you can suddenly think of something. Oh, I can see a raised hand, but I'm clicking, but I can't see who it is.
I think it's Rodrigo.
Can you see it? I have a.
Rodrigo, would you like to? Or did you?
Oh, yeah. No, I have audio. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much. It was fascinating. I'm from Brazil, so I will have an accent talking. But I wanted to ask you about if you have any thoughts on heterology in relation to the Informe, because I think when Bataille is writing about heterology, he's really going to a systematic kind of thinking that is almost cybernetics in relation to how the how do I say it? The heteronomous,
heterogeneous, yeah.
Yes, heterogeneous is produced and repressed. So I think he's almost making a topology of noise. If you can elaborate on these relations.
Yeah, that's very provocative, I think. I mean, heterology. So I might answer just by saying that there are, I think, 12 volumes of Bataille's complete works in French, and I'd say probably about a third of that is published works, or a half maybe, and the other half is unpublished projects. And the heterology project is one of the unpublished projects, which is a kind of instance of, I think, looking at the complete works, you can see how Bataille is always currently trying to systematize his thinking. And he comes up with different ways of trying to do this. And the heterology project, which is from the early 30s, I think, is one instance of this attempt to think this kind of the mess of the Informe more systematically by talking about the homogeneous and the heterologous and the totally other object, drawing terms and concepts from French sociology, but also from German theology. Rudolf Otto, I think, is someone he relates to there. So yes, it's true that he attempts to theorize what he calls the heterology, so a science or knowledge of the other object, and conceives of this notion of the totally other object, which is conflated with the sacred object. And yes, I think it would be very interesting to think of that in relation to noise as well, to think of how that threshold, if you like, that Giovanni introduced between heterogeneous and homogeneous, between general economy and restricted economy, is used. And that was kind of what I was trying to suggest at the beginning of the talk, that this idea of the threshold, so that's Giovanni's idea. I don't think that was not my term, but that's a really good one, I think. How that operates also in French theory in quite a general sense. So, for example, between Christeva's notion of the symbolic and the semiotic, in Barth's obvious and obtuse and studium and punctum, they often seem to be about this threshold between something that is seen as often kind of devalued as boring information. Perhaps the threshold is the one we're there between redundancy and information. Yeah. But those things kind of, this redundancy, information, noise triad, if you like, and Bataille's dyads and Barth's dyads are kind of instantly mapped onto one another. So, yeah, great question. Further talk.
Thank you.
It looks like Adam had a question.
Oh, why do you? Oh, yeah.
Hi, can you see and hear us okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you for that paper. It was fantastic. I'm sorry if this question, if you kind of answered it at the end, I was struggling to keep up. There's so much kind of weighty stuff at the end. It probably speaks more to the Bataille portion of your paper rather than the information theory. But this point you made at the end about, subversive intent potentially being a form of information, and whether that kind of undermines, I guess, a transgressive element in Bataille's thought. It's something I'm really interested in Bataille, this effort to work towards this kind of formless state, and whether or not some kind of any direct action like that kind of undermines it. But I guess the question I was going to ask relates to what role perhaps chance plays in all of this. Because, chance seems to speak to a certain element of unpredictability in noise itself, whether in, a basic form of information theory of the disruption, the unpredictable disruption between 2 points of a message, or the unpredictability of noise in music, for instance, in noise music, and the unpredictable dimension of that. And then there's the role chance plays in some of Bataille's thought as well. It seems to be that, chance seems important for Bataille. It seems to refer to something that might occur without direct intention. So, I'm thinking of, I'm reading at the moment some of the ACFAL documents, and, some of the ACFAL events coming a bit later than the things you've mentioned, but it seemed to be that they just create these spaces for an encounter without a direct intention in the hope that something might just occur. So I'm just wondering if maybe chance has a role to play here in information theory in relationship to noise, and noise in perhaps Bataille's work as well.
Yes, thank you. Another really great question. I think I might answer it by saying that yes, chance does play a great role in huge role in Bataille's thought, particularly in his engagements with Nietzsche. But I suppose to kind of link it to some of the other questions and some of the issue of the threshold, for example, I think there are two ways in which one might think of chance in Bataille's writing and thought. One is this tendency, perhaps, on his part to thematize chance, which, if you like, takes the chance out of it. If he writes about chance as this disruptive factor, as precisely kind of the will to chance, if you like, the volonté de chance. I think as he quotes from Nietzsche. But when he writes about chance as a concept, if you like, or a theme, that tends to, turn it into something that means something rather than something that's disruptive of meaning.
Mm.
But the other aspect, I think, is there are these moments in Bataille's writing, and sometimes quite hard to define, where you can't discern any logic to the link between what, in Story of the Eye, for example, there's a very curious moment where he says something like, I won't be able to remember exactly, but this conjunction of events was like, it's something like a jar of mustard again. So then he says something like a cockerel crowing on a tin roof, and no idea what the cockerel is doing on the tin roof or how it relates to any other aspect or signifier in the récit, in the narrative. And I think there are these, it's this kind of symptom of a kind of tendency at the level of Bataille's writing itself, for him to, where these random signifiers get introduced, which aren't thematized, don't seem to relate to any concept or disruptive intention, but are just there almost at the level of the writing as kind of something that's gone wrong.
Mm.
So, that might be generally true of anyone's writing, but I think it struck me as being particularly, and I don't think it's just that Bataille is a bad writer, if you like, but there's an aspect in which his writing is just bits that fall out of the systematic of the system, which he's also trying to articulate.
Mm.
I didn't really answer your question, but
no, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Oh.
Cécile, did you have a?
Sorry,
I think Mark or.
I wanted to say there's a comment here. Alan Weiss.
Yeah, that's just a.
Alan Weiss has some things written on Bataille and will to chance.
Thank you.
Mark.
Yeah, Patrick, thank you very much. That was really great. I really enjoyed your talk a lot, and it's wonderful, I have to say, to see Cécile's vision of very different approaches to noise coming to fruition. You near the end of your talk, you talked about symbolic and statistical noise. I'm going to try to restate your reading. Hopefully I'm not off. So as I could see it, you're talking about symbolic noise in terms of the kind of the undesired. So we might talk about that as noise that has a kind of a let's say a material reality. It has a kind of a semantic representational reality. Contrasting that then with statistical noise. And we could say statistical noise, I read that as thinking in terms of, let's say, developments within machine learning. So we can think about maybe neural networks. Here, if we think about statistical noise, we can think about that kind of the computational architecture of neural networks, which allow for a kind of a massive parallel calculation of elementary, last week when I was talking about in terms of this is the infinitesimal and functions or characteristics or features, whatever you want to call it. And in that meaning is something that emerges actually interestingly in this architecture on a collective level, the collective level of the neural network, right? It's an emergent effect of interaction. And this is where that, we could say, noisy relationality generates meaning across these sort of sub-symbolic microscopic elements. So, okay, I mean, now I guess I don't have a question that I necessarily expect or think that there's a straightforward answer for, but at least it's something worth raising. I mean, today you were giving us a really quite advanced conceptual and philosophical engagement with noise, much of which emerged in relation to a different model of, not a different model, because the essence of information theory, especially as practiced by Shannon, holds just as much today, but it's applied differently. So I guess, what does it mean? Like, what are the conceptual or philosophical implications when what you're calling statistical noise, and rightly so, I think, becomes a productive means for the measure, for the calculation, for the production of new kinds of emergent meaning, right? So this is, again, that meaning that emerges on the collective net level across those neural networks. Because in a sense, this is the deep, if you will, of deep learning, right? So this is meaning as that emergent effect of interaction, of that noisy relationality. So, like, I know that I'm transposing your distinction of the symbolic statistical noise onto computational models, but I think that was at least in part your intent. So we have a new kind of technical referent for noise. So, okay, maybe to narrow that down, should this mean anything for kind of scholarship on Bataille?
Thanks, Mark. That was really lot of that I won't be able to respond to, but I think, yes, I mean, it's precisely because of this disjunction really between the symbolic level on which Bataille is operating and the statistical level on which he isn't. That it's in that disjunction, which is the challenge to try and think that relation between, if you like, infinitesimal relationality and what meaning might arise out of that. Should it mean anything for Bataille scholarship? I suppose yes and no, because I think of it in a historical way, that when Bataille is writing, you know, I don't mean simply in terms of the development of technology, and it was different when he was writing from now, but more in the sense of the history of symbolic forms, if you like, that he's dealing with, perhaps one could argue, more deeply embedded, more socially and politically embedded, and more socially and politically hierarchized, a more hierarchized shape of symbols of meaning than we might be now, or that machines might be now, if you like. So there might be parallels, I guess, but I think one has to be historically specific about what Bataille was engaging with and what, in a very crude and probably abusive sense the machines are engaging with at the level of information. So, but I don't know. I mean, there's something that I've not yet really thought through around this question of the subjective dimension of it. I mean, and how that's more at the level of reception, really, how the subject receives the information or the noise and what their effective response to it is. That might be something, or whether what counts as meaning for a subject listening to a signal. That was very vague.
There's a short question, a tiny question, in fact, in the chat, and that's if noise can be considered as information, does this mean that we can never escape the noise? Like we can't escape language games in Wittgenstein. Is there a possibility to make a connection between the two, or is it far-fetched?
I'm sure there could be a connection, just we're not sure if I'll be able to think it through, between Wittgenstein's language games and Bataille's, well, and information and noise, yes. But again, I suppose we're again dealing with this threshold, or no, not threshold, this kind of décalage or differend between information and noise on a statistical level and semantics and language, I guess, language in the sense of semantic language, which I think is what Wittgenstein is talking about, but that's not exactly a very satisfactory response. I think Cecile was about to ask something.
Yes, I really enjoy this conversation so much, and thanks, Mark, for bringing the last session into it as well. I don't really have something very intelligent to say, just a personal note perhaps, that the thing that's always in the back of my mind when you think about Shannon's information, and that connects to your talk, especially when you talked about the decision that scrambles all decisions, is the fact that when the information engineer, the electrical engineer, finds the best possible way to transmit a message, someone has taken the decision that this message is worth transmitting for whatever reasons. It's interesting that we can bracket the question of signification out of this, but where it connects with the decision that scrambles all the decisions is that there are forces at play, including algorithms. If you design a rule, if I'm not mistaken, an algorithm is a rule that has to be designed by someone, even if it's designed in such a way as to then self-differentiate and start designing itself within certain parameters. What are the forces at play for wanting that rule to play out? I think this is an area that probably I don't think has a field of literature attached to it already, but for me, it's where the two sessions, the last session and this session, connects.
That's great. I mean, I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's where the Nietzsche that Barthes referred to is important, this sense of the evaluation preceding the fact, and interpretations preceding, which he counts as evaluations, preceding the truth, or fictions, as he calls them. But yeah, precisely the kind of the decision, and therefore the decision to value this kind of action or message or signal over that one, which and that was why I was thinking that question I asked about Bataille kind of having something to say and saying it and it making sense. So in that way, it's not subversive at all from that point of view. But if one thinks that perhaps he wasn't really sure what he was going to say, he didn't necessarily, it was more of a kind of performative play rather to see what would happen, more of an improvisation, that starts to perhaps shake the foundations of the subject and the deciding subject, if you like.
If you think, sorry, there's another.
Please go ahead, Cecile. I think we have time if you want to ask a follow-up.
There's one tiny follow-up. what really struck me with Weaver's actually improvised distinction, when he realizes, oh, actually information is the same as noise, or rather, the information entropy is a measure of entropy, noise is a measure of entropy, so how do you tell the two apart? And then he says, well, one is spurious. But that's precisely a value, and all of a sudden you have, in a completely objective quantifying theory that is nothing to do with meaning, value right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
I don't know, I find that exciting.
Yeah.
So sorry, over to the question. I can't see on my screen, unfortunately, who's raising the hand. I can see only the number of participants in the hand, please.
I think Shu Feng first.
Hi, thanks for the fascinating paper, Patrick. I'm going to keep my webcam off as I'm in the middle of dinner. That's one of the advantages of working from home, being able to attend excellent talks and have dinner at the same time. I think my question is also, in some ways, a bit similar to the first part of Cecile's question, which is to pick up on this idea of evaluation and what you were saying at the end of your paper about whether all noise is information and how do we evaluate it, according to our priorities and our values. So is Bataille really engaged in a sort of mischievous negation of existing forms of value by emphasizing the Informe and by allowing other associations to emerge in this critical dictionary? And would that be seen as a mere negation, or is there something positive there as well, in the sense of a kind of positive establishment of another alternative system of values, of which one may be aware or unaware? For example, if you think about which associations are allowed to emerge, you may not be exercising much agency in that, but the ones that do emerge might be ones which are adjacent to the historically current mode of discourse. So it's not as though all possibilities are equal, but rather some are more likely than others. So by negating an existing set of values or associations, another comes to take its place. So one could, I guess, insist on a sort of generalized system of ethics or mode of thinking, which is to insist on openness and on negation, and to have dynamism, and to be against ossification and sort of stagnation. But by doing that, I think there is also a kind of positive contribution that's being made. So my question really is about to what extent is Bataille aware of, or does he acknowledge that sort of positive contribution? What does he think about it?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question, because I think Bataille uses terms like parody in the solar anus text, and a lot of his terms and his his story of the eye and the solar anus look like they're kind of negations in the sense of provocations, just like purely of subversive intent, let's say. But I think there is also what I'd call what in your terms might be seen as a positive contribution, if you like, or a positivistic contribution, which is almost a kind of anthropology or cosmogony. So in this reference to nature, for example, so in a very crude sense, Bataille says that the definitions of words are not their meanings, but what they do. Or the definitions that the critical dictionary is going to give is not the meanings of words, but what these words do. And what they do is to operate at the level of what he calls attraction and repulsion. And he relates that to the, can't remember the exact term, but the dynamics of nature, as if, the natural world, the material world, is operating almost at this kind of submolecular level of attraction and repulsion. So I don't think he has a kind of robust scientific grasp of, or concept of that, but he's referring to a kind of, it's not purely a kind of critical theory, if you like, or a critique of kind of historically embedded meaning of the time. He and perhaps he's different in this from the other contributors like Michel Léris, Robert Desnos, and others to the Document Critical Dictionary. I think there is this pretension, or not, yeah, that's the wrong word, ambition to have a theory of the cosmos, if you like, and for it to be grounded in material and natural reality. When he later on talks about the sun as giving its energy without reserve, he's drawing on scientists, or his friends who are scientists at the time, like Georges Ambrosino, for example. And there's some moments in which he comes very close to, he refers to Eddington, for example, and he comes quite close to reference and commentary on theorists of entropy, but it's not very clear. So yes, there is a kind of sense in which he's wanting to establish something positivistic, if not positive.
Yeah, that's interesting. He turns to such a sort of intellectual bedrock and these very foundational ideas of attraction and repulsion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think there's a question in the chat, but I think Michael had his hand up first. So, Michael, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, I can do. I'm not sure if my camera is going to work. I'm wondering. First of all, I missed last session, so I'm not quite maybe where you all are. But I was wondering about the Informe and the strange suspension between operation, the task, and what you may call an ontology when you speak about or when he speaks about universe. And I'm trying to work out if I use the notion of noise in a similar manner. So at what point do we speak about things that have a certain status of being noisy or not? And in what sense is noise a task, like noisifying, if you want to call it like this? So in particular, with regard to Mark's question, whether or not traditional rule-based algorithmic systems have become noisified and therefore deliver different epistemic potentials, because the norm of which Cecile spoke, the rules, are somehow suspended if they're noisified, if you see what I mean, because they are not on the level of identification and form and representation anymore. Now, there may still be rules or norms, but the desire or the attempt or the task, that's the word, the task to noisify those seem to have different effects. So I'm just wondering whether if we bring Informe and noise together, we are not too strongly ontologizing noise.
Yes, I think we would be, as long as, my response, maybe other people can respond to that great question as well, but if the Informe is seen as an ontological category, or if we ontologize the Informe as the formless, then I think that would be a mistake to associate noise with that. But that would risk also ontologizing noise as something that is substantive. But I suppose what Bataille says and what Barthes tries to draw out is that the notion of the Informe as an operation, which I don't know how to translate into English. The translation is formless, which looks like a kind of ontological non-category, but still is made into a substantive. But if we think of the Informe as an operation, and this is what Rosalind Krauss tries to do a lot in her work on the Informe by pointing to Giacometti's sculptures, for example, early sculptures, for example, as with the suspended ball, for example, as an operation or an oscillation in her terms, rather than Christopher's what Krauss thinks Christopher's account of the Informe is, which is something like the abject stuff, abject forms. So I think there would be an avenue to pursue around thinking of both the Informe and noise as a task. But I might hand over to others to think about that task, the task of noise.
Well, that would connect quite well with, there's another question in the chat from Richard Crow, and which is what is the relation of noise with Bataille's theory of base materialism? I don't know whether that's restating the same question or whether that kind of specifies it a bit more.
That's a very good question and quite a difficult one to answer, because again, the base materialism, or the bas materialism, is another of those moments in Bataille's thought where he's trying to systematize it or to get to a theory. And here, I think he's particularly grappling with Marxism, with the historical materialism, dialectical materialism, but also with more less familiar things like Gnosticism. So there's an essay called Base Materialism and Gnosticism, where he's trying to think about the kind of very Manichean dualistic universe of the Gnostics and relate that to Marxist dialectical materialism in ways that I don't fully understand. So I'm not sure if there is so much of a resonance between the theory of noise, or between noise and the notion of base materialism. I mean, it looks like there should be, but I think base materialism, again, is too much of a dialectic, perhaps, but I don't know. I've run myself aground there, I think. Cecilia, you were going to say something. You're still on mute. You're still on mute, Cecile.
I think maybe in the meantime, maybe Chris can ask a question.
You're also still on mute.
So I get to say my thing first. I just wanted to say
whoever gets there first.
Mono has a really interesting moment when he talks about the apeiron, or the unbounded, as what one could also call as a potential concept of matter. Sorry, I'm trying to put this back together from memory. Parenthesis closed. But I think a completely different materialism could emerge as a kind of pendant to this form of noise, or informe.
Thanks, yeah. Did you say Simondon? Yeah. Chris.
Hello. Thank you all. Yeah, this is really fantastic stuff. I'm going to start off with a little playful appropriation, because I was struck, Patrick, that you used the expression bleeding to one another twice when you were speaking of the different forms. And then I couldn't help but at some point think about the question of violence more broadly, but also in Bataille, whether we want to think about it in terms of sacrifice, and therefore, if you like, a very structured form of task, or very structured task. But if we were to ask more sort of broader ethical political questions about, you know, the different levels of disturbance, but also the different kinds of agency that we attribute when we think of noise as not simply as disturbance, but as violence or as harm, whether that is, you know, self-harm or harm towards the other. This is not really this is an invitation really to reflect on perhaps talking about force. And I'm thinking violence non-normatively, really, but to sort of think of force in relation to violence as well, and disturbance.
Yes, that does. That could prompt a lot of reflection, I think. I think there's different levels. I think the relation between the proximity, the porousness between noise as disturbance and that disturbance as a force, and thus as a form of violence of whatever direction, is very provocative. And I suppose that's on one hand, and I don't really have the, let's say, I don't have the resources to think it through just at the moment. But I think it's also a very pertinent question for Bataille, who, as you suggest, sacrifice was a key, was always, well, up to a certain point, a key concept in his thought, and not so much at the moment of document, but very soon after, his kind of obsessive fascination with the scene of sacrifice. So one might perhaps see that the route, if you like, from the task of the Informe as and the ways in which, as I think I also said, these relations are inflicted upon human subjects. One might see the route from that kind of thinking to Bataille's obsessive kind of focus on the scene of sacrifice, either anthropologically or in his own contemporaneity. He has these photographs of the torture and execution of a Japanese man in his later work. And that's a limit, a kind of ethical limit perhaps in Bataille's thought, which I know that Jean-Luc Nancy has and Agamben have also kind of pushed at. Yeah, so I think that could go quite a long way. And I think that, yeah, I didn't intend to do this, but in one of my books on Bataille, after Bataille, that I do kind of try and trace that notion of sacrifice, or Bataille's concept of sacrifice, up to its point where he has to abandon it, or where it can't be thought any further. So that's a partial response to some aspects of your question, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Patrick. I think we might just have time for one last question. I think if we can squeeze it in from Lawrence Kent.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, thank you so much for such a brilliant talk. I think it follows on from the last question quite interestingly, because I was kind of thinking about this, the kind of dual meanings of disturbance. Because I mean, I really liked how you were placing Bataille within these, you were asking with these two definitions of noise. Noise is information, noise is disturbance. Was it one, was it either, was it neither perhaps? And I really like this idea of kind of like, thinking about the possibility of hovering in between, the resistance to form, the resistance, noise retaining its resistance to, being recuperated in the restricted economy, but at the same time not being noise as purely spurious or able to be ignored in some ways. But then obviously, so I was then thinking about noise as disturbance in I guess like psychologizing it in relation to sort of obviously vulgar terms now, but like in terms of like madness and the disturbed and the kind of like how noise kind of like hovers there. And obviously we're talking about going into the Weaver's idea of the desirable, undesirable. I mean, you mentioned desire isn't perhaps a word, is a word in Bataille's thought, but like thinking through Deleuze-Guattari, I mean, obviously pure desire might then be this interesting in between of those two things. And then that becomes, pure desire is like, a kind of induced madness, nature is cosmic schizophrenia, the play of pure functions. So I was thinking what perhaps role of noises, what role, what that would mean in relation to Bataille, and obviously perhaps Virgil Thomas, but like playing with madness or playing with some ideas of those kind of limit experiences.
Thanks, that's great as well. I mean, I think, again, I'm not going to answer your question, but to answer a different question, because it made me think about Cecile's point earlier about disturbance and the spurious. So one thing, you could think of these things in a purely relational way, that if noise disturbs something, it's only disturbs something if you have an idea of what it's disturbing, what's being disturbed, the order that's being disturbed. And what's spurious is only spurious in relation to something that is essential, I suppose. But I suppose where those things might start to become more telling, well, not that they're not telling anyway, but where might be in relation to the body, where the disturbance is a wounding or a violence or a form of violence, or perhaps in relation to madness, where the disturbance is a kind of suffering, it involves a kind of suffering as well. And that's a register that Bataille is operating on is operating on, the level of, but quite dubiously perhaps as well, where suffering becomes a kind of, is erotically valued. But I think that your question definitely poses that question of the kind of impact, if you like, of the valuation of disturbance, or the disturbing or the spurious, in relation to, I'll say things that are real. But I'm aware I'm getting myself into trouble by saying that. Anyway.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
I mean, we could end there unless anyone. Oh, someone. There was one more question. Do you have? Perhaps you have the energy for it. Subro Saha. If you're still in the meeting, Subro, you could ask the question.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Just about, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Cecil, for letting me know about this event, and thank you, Patrick. This was a wonderful talk. Very dense, and I was certain things were going on from the very beginning, because you started with phantasm, and then a kind of an organizing that is always there as part of any conceptualizing, because while we are trying to create an epistemology of noise or conceptualizing noise, there is this organizing principle also operating, with which we are trying to epistemologically define noise or discuss noise. So I was just thinking one part, this is a discussion of epistemology and ontology within also a huge debate within Marxism. Let's see if I take Althusser on the materialistic dialectic, that on the one hand, where he's talking about that the experience is there, we need to take out a theory out of it, not the opposite, that we create a theory and we then try to bring it into, experience or practice. So in the opposite way, which Althusser talks about, I was thinking that this is kind of directly linked with this thinking the epistemology of noise, or conceptualizing noise or philosophizing noise, that something which is operational, while we try to bring it into a framework, there is also the slippage, there is also the excess, there is also the, unanticipatable, which is already there. And we are trying to bring it into a kind of a rigor, a kind of a training, a kind of a epistemologizing that. So I was thinking that it's obvious in your paper also, where you're reflecting from, on the one hand, the phantasmagoric, and on the other hand, the mathematizing of, sound in Chanot and Weaver with mathematical theorems and so on. So I was also thinking that, don't you feel that this epistemologizing of noise, while it is, I'm not talking about necessity, it's obvious, it can also counter a different way of philosophizing the, the ontological or the immediate or the material concerns, without necessarily holding on to the centrality of visible, because the entire logos and the entire huge philosophical lineage that had been given to the visible, it can be kind of offers us a new way of thinking without essentially resorting to that register of thinking, where presence had always been associated, possible has always been associated in terms of the visible, in terms of, and whereas here we are trying to enter the question of, ontological, the material, the immediate, without necessarily holding on to the visible. This is also kind of giving us, again, as the title and as the title of the entire seminar is, why we need to, develop a epistemology of noise, which not only talks of noise, which also pushes in a larger, wider philosophizing necessity and in newer registers. It was not, I know it's not a kind of a question, but just to reflect. Yeah.
No, it's great. Thank you very much. There's a lot in what you said, and I think it relates to the seminar series as a whole, and this kind of, if you like, the fault line, perhaps, if that's the right way of putting it, between epistemology of noise and the aesthetics of noise, or one might also say the experience of noise. And I think that's, if I might say so, the value of my paper coming after Mark's paper, not after Mark's, as in Mark's, Karl Mark. Sorry. But yeah, because Bataille, I think, is kind of operating at this threshold between, the epistemology of the Informe, if you like, what it does to knowledge, or the counter epistemology, if you like, but also trying to grasp something around experience. I mean, that's a key term in Bataille's work, this notion of what he calls inner experience or immediacy, constantly, relentlessly trying to get behind the concepts and the words with which he's trying to articulate the experience, which is sometimes also not of the visible. I mean, there's often of music, not so much of noise in the acoustic sense, but of music. So there's definitely a kind of more to do there, I think.
Cecile, would you like to close with?
Yeah. I'm really happy. It's Christmas for me. It doesn't really get much better than 2 hours talking about noise, scanning everybody else's ideas. Really cool. I'm so happy, and so many exciting questions. And the thing that made me particularly happy is the fact that we could connect. That there is a loose connection here, but a significant one between the two seminars. And it's a bit like when you invite people from different parts of your life to a party, and you don't know if they're going to have anything to say to each other, but they do. And I think one of the thoughts behind this seminar of the aesthetics of noise, following on to my previous work on the aesthetics of noise, was the idea of empiricism and aesthetics. At what point is experience validated as giving knowledge, and at what point is it an experience that is mostly an expression of value? Anyway, with this, we will have more seminars to discuss this. I'm so excited. Thank you so much. Thanks, Giovanni. Thanks, Mark, for this wonderful, wonderful moment of Bataille and Barthes and all this amazing background and these probing ways of dealing with this material. I'm just going to say to everyone, I'm going to go and grab a glass of wine, and when I come back, if there's still anybody who wants to stay in the channel to have an informal chat, you're very welcome. And if not, I'm going to have a glass of wine by myself. Okay, so for tonight, thank you very much, and goodbye to anyone who has other commitments, who needs to leave, or who's had enough of this noise.